The trial hall of Ashenvail had not been opened for a reckoning in 4 decades, and yet every seat within its cold stone walls was filled before the morning bell finished ringing. Silverin had counted 214 faces by the time the charges were read for the second time. Pack elders from every province, council members in their ceremonial gray, warriors who had ridden through 2 nights to witness what the official summons described as a matter of crown integrity. She recognized none of them as allies. She had not expected to find any. She stood in the accused circle, a ring of iron set into the ancient flagstones at the center of the hall. Her wrists bound with silver cord that was thin enough to appear ceremonial and strong enough to stop any wolf from shifting. Silverin was not a wolf. The cord had not been fastened for her benefit. It had been fastened so that everyone watching would understand, before a single word of testimony was offered, what category of creature she had already been assigned to. The charges were bond theft, false claiming, and willful deception of the crown. Each accusation had landed in the hall like something thrown from a height, and the ripples had not yet settled. Murmurs moved through the benches in waves. Someone near the western gallery laughed, quiet and contemptuous, and did not stop when heads turned. Silverin did not look at any of them. She looked only at the dais. Varek sat in the judgment seat at the far end of the hall, his expression so carefully composed it had ceased to resemble anything that lived behind it. He wore the formal black of crown proceedings, the silver chain of office across his chest, catching the morning light from the high windows. He had not looked at her once since the guards brought her in. Not when her name was spoken into the record. Not when the first witness was sworn. Not in the 2 full hours since she had entered this circle, and the silver cord was fastened around her wrists. She had known him differently once. She had known the man who came to the border territories 3 seasons ago under the pretense of a diplomatic survey, and remained 6 weeks longer than any survey required. The man who sat beside her in the healer's archives for entire afternoons, with his formal titles set aside, asking questions that had nothing to do with trade agreements or boundary lines. The man whose fever she had broken alone on the 4th night of a winter storm, when no physician could reach the lodge, and his wolf had surfaced through the delirium and pressed its great head against her hands, as though it recognized something in her touch that his waking mind had not yet found the language for. She had not told anyone about that night. That had been her first mistake, and she had been living inside the consequences of it ever since. The evidence being presented against her came entirely from House Cadron. Lord Kelric of Cadron delivered it with the methodical satisfaction of a man who had been building this case far longer than the formal proceedings suggested. False witness accounts read into the record with careful solemnity. A stack of fabricated correspondence, each letter bearing a version of her seal that was almost correct. A servant's testimony about meetings that had either been invented entirely or bent so far from their original shape that she barely recognized the outline of what had actually occurred. Silverin listened to all of it without moving. She had learned in the outer territories that visible fear was a weapon handed freely to those who intended to use it, and she would not arm Lord Kelric with anything she could keep from him. At the Cadron table, Maris watched her with the composed expression of a woman who had already decided what she would wear to her own coronation. She was striking in the specific way that certainty made people striking, all deliberate grace and careful arrangement, her dark hair dressed with the silver pins of a formal betrothal candidate. The betrothal had not been announced yet. It did not need to be. Its shape was visible in every decision that had been made about this trial, in every witness called and every charge selected. Silverin was not the crime. She was the inconvenience that had to be formally removed before the real business could proceed. She was still watching Maris when the hall doors at the far end opened. A young handler appeared in the doorway, slightly breathless, his face carrying the expression of someone who had made a significant professional error and had not yet decided how to announce it. He was holding an empty leather lead, heads turned. The pup came from the side passage between the eastern pillars, moving with the unhurried confidence of a creature that had never been informed it was unwelcome anywhere. It was still growing into its adult form, its pale silver-gray fur thick against the cold of the stone hall, its broad paws crossing the flagstones without hesitation or detour. The royal hearth wolf. Varek's pup, bonded to him since birth, raised in the inner chambers of the crown wing. An animal whose instincts were considered, by the law of every pack in Kerith, to be beyond corruption or manipulation. It should not have been here. Hearthwolves were never brought to formal proceedings. It crossed the trial floor without pausing to investigate the crowded benches or the scent-heavy air of 200 wolves in an enclosed space. It did not approach the dais. It did not approach Lord Kelrick. It walked in a straight line directly to the accused circle, sat down at Sylvan's feet, looked up at her face for exactly one breath, and then climbed into her lap. The hall went silent. Not the polite quiet between arguments, not the held breath before a ruling. This was the silence of 200 wolves experiencing an instinct override simultaneously, every trained response suspended while something older and more fundamental processed what they had just witnessed. Sylvan did not move. She could feel the pup's warmth against her bound hands, its weight settling against her lap with a certainty that made something shift deep in her chest, something she had been trying to keep still for weeks. She felt the silver cord press against her wrist, directly over the place where the mark lay hidden beneath her sleeve, and for one breathless moment the warmth of both things seemed to answer each other. She looked up. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, Varric was looking directly at her. His eyes were amber. They were not empty anymore. Something moved behind them, immense and unreadable, and for one suspended moment the hall seemed to stop existing entirely. There was only the pup warm against her hands, and his gaze finding hers across the length of that cold stone room, and something in that moment felt more like testimony than anything Lord Kelrick had offered in 2 hours. Then Lord Kelrick cleared his throat. "My king," he said, his voice precisely controlled. "The animal has entered without authorization. It is a distraction from the gravity of these proceedings, and should be removed immediately." The moment fractured. Varric's gaze moved from Sylvan to the pup, to a point somewhere between them that contained neither. When he spoke, his voice had returned to the same quality she had been watching from this circle all morning. Empty, careful, decided. "Remove the accused from the hall," he said. "We will recess until the animal is secured." The handler reached the circle and lifted the pup from her lap. It did not struggle. It only turned its head and watched Sylvan steadily as the guards closed their hands around her arms and walked her toward the side door. The hall did not speak until she was through it. She did not cry in the corridor. She had made herself that promise before they brought her in, and she kept it. What she could not stop noticing as she pressed her back against the stone wall and tried to breathe evenly was the warmth coming from beneath her sleeve. The mark that had no right to still be there, still warm, still present, pulsing with something that felt nothing at all like an ending. She had perhaps 2 hours before the recess concluded, and the verdict was formally entered. She did not intend to be here for it. She moved through the servants' passage with her head down and her steps measured, following the route she had memorized 3 days ago on the chance that she would need it. The outer gate, the lower road, the forest line before the capital's boundary wolves made their evening circuit. She did not look back, and she did not see, as she passed beneath the upper gallery with its carved stone screen, the figure standing motionless in the shadows behind it. Watching her go. Watching with an expression that bore no resemblance to anything happening on the trial floor below, and that no one who knew his face well would have been able to name on sight. 6 weeks later, the village of Thornbarrow had stopped being suspicious of her. Sylvain had arrived in the deep freeze of the cold season carrying a traveling pack, a name she had not made complicated, and a story about a healer's circuit contract in the northern provinces that had ended without ceremony. The village elder had looked at her hands, noted the calluses of someone who genuinely knew how to prepare a poultice, and offered her the empty room above the grain store in exchange for her services through the season. She had given him the name Vera, accepted the room, and been careful about everything else. The mark was the worst of it. In the law of Kerith, a severed bond left nothing behind. When a formal decree of rejection was entered into the crown record, as hers had been, read aloud into the trial proceedings in language that stripped her of any claim to the crown's recognition, the physical evidence of any bond was supposed to dissolve within weeks. Return to ordinary skin. This was not sentiment or tradition. It was documented wolf-bond science, recorded in the same archives she had spent months studying at Varek's side. The mark on the inside of her left wrist had not faded. It had appeared on the morning after the winter storm, the morning after the night she had broken his fever and his wolf had surfaced through the delirium and done something neither of them had named before she left the border lodge. It was not a claiming bite. Nothing had been deliberate. The oldest texts in the archive called it an imprinting, a thing that happened rarely and without intention when a wolf's instinct recognized a true mate in the moments of its greatest vulnerability. Unplanned. Unbreakable by anything less than death on one side of the bond. She covered it every morning. Every morning it was warmer than it had been the night before. At night, lying still in the dark above the grain store while Thornbarrow slept around her, she felt the other thing. The thing she had been refusing to name since before the trial. The change happening beneath her skin, patient and persistent, making itself known in ways she could not keep explaining away, as fatigue or grief or the ordinary toll of a life disrupted. Her senses arrived sharper than they should have. Her hands were sometimes restless in the hours before dawn, as though they were waiting for something she could not identify. And the dreams pressed against her like a presence rather than a story, as if something on the far side of them was reaching through and finding no handhold. She was not a wolf. She had not been born to any wolf bloodline. Whatever the incomplete bond had begun to do to her in that storm-dark room in the border territories, she had no framework for it, no precedent she could locate, and no one she trusted enough to ask. Then, one night in the coldest part of the season, the mark flared so sharply it woke her from a dead sleep. Not the low, steady warmth she had grown used to tolerating. Something directed, something with intention behind it. A pulse, distinct and deliberate, as if something on the other end of the bond had reached out with purpose and found her exactly where she was. She lay in the dark with her wrist pressed to her chest and told herself it meant nothing. The mark pulsed again. Softer the second time, but unmistakable. As if whatever was on the other end had found what it was looking for and was simply, quietly, confirming it. She did not sleep again that night. "Mistress Vera?" The voice came from the foot of the stairs, bright with the restless energy of someone carrying news they considered important. Petra, the Grain Elder's youngest daughter, had appointed herself Sylvain's primary source of information from the outside world with an enthusiasm that made avoidance difficult. Sylvain set down her mortar. "What is it?" Petra climbed the last 2 steps and stopped in the doorway, cheeks pink from the cold outside. "A trader came through on the southern road last night. He stayed at my father's house. He had news from the capital." Sylvain's hands became very still. "About the trial," Petra said, lowering her voice as though the room required it. "About what happened after." "Tell me," Sylvain said. Petra came fully inside and sat on the top step in the manner of someone settling in for a longer conversation than Sylvain intended to permit. "The trader says there was no verdict. After the recess called on the day of the proceedings, the king dismissed the entire session, sent the council home without a ruling. No conviction entered, No sentence issued, no formal outcome of any kind. Sylvan said nothing. She was very aware of her own heartbeat. He says things in the capital have been unsettled since. The council has been pushing to reconvene, and the king keeps refusing. Lord Cadron issued a public statement 3 weeks ago demanding a formal ruling, and the king's office returned no response at all. Not even an acknowledgement. That is not possible, Sylvan said quietly, and was not certain which part of it she meant. Petra hesitated, which was unlike her. There is more. The traitor says the king has not been seen in public since the day of the trial, not at any formal occasion, not at the provincial hearings that were already scheduled. His advisors have been managing everything. Some of the outer provinces are saying he has taken ill. She paused. Others are saying something else. What are the others saying? Sylvan asked. That he is searching for someone. Petra's voice dropped further. That he has been searching since the morning the trial was dismissed and has not stopped. That whoever he is looking for, he has not found them yet. Sylvan turned toward the window before her face could say anything she had not decided to say. She looked at the ice on the mill pond below, thin and gray in the flat winter light. And she thought about a man sitting in a judgment seat with his eyes made carefully empty, giving an order in a voice she had not recognized. She thought about the pup settling its weight into her lap in a room full of people who had already decided what she was. She thought about the pulse that had woken her in the darkest part of the night, reaching across whatever distance lay between her and a mark that was not supposed to still be alive. "Thank you, Petra," she said. "Tell no one you brought this to me." After Petra left, Sylvan stood at the window for a long time without moving. Outside, the ice on the mill pond held. Inside, something she had been keeping equally solid began, without her permission, to crack. 2 months in Thornbarrow, and Sylvan had learned the rhythms of a life that was not hers well enough to stop noticing the difference. She rose before the village and prepared the remedies that needed the cold hours. She took her meals alone. She answered to Vera without hesitation and had almost stopped flinching at the sound of it. She was, by any visible measure, a woman settling into the quiet shape of a new beginning. The mark had pulsed again last night, twice in the darkest part of the early hours, with that same directed quality she had noticed the first time. Deliberate and searching. She had lain awake afterward with her wrist pressed flat against her chest, listening to the village sleep around her, and tried to calculate how long she could reasonably stay before the name Vera ran out of distance from the name she had left behind. She was standing at the hearth stirring a preparation for the miller's cough when someone knocked. Not Petra. Petra's knock was bright and impatient. This one was measured, 3 times, evenly spaced, with the quality of someone who had already decided they would wait as long as necessary. Sylvan set down the wooden spoon and did not move for a moment. Then she crossed to the door and opened it. The man on the other side was older than she had expected. His close-cropped hair shot through with silver at the temples, his traveling clothes worn enough to suggest days on the road rather than hours. He was not a large man, but he carried himself the way people did when size had never been the point. His eyes were a deep, steady amber, and when they found her face, they did not shift around it the way eyes did when they were looking at someone they had only been told to find. He was looking at her the way eyes did when they already knew exactly who they had found. "Sylvan," he said, not a question. Her hand tightened on the door frame. "I think you have the wrong house." "The mark is on your left wrist," he said quietly. "Inside, where the cord would have pressed during the trial." The king described it in detail to anyone who might have a reason to recognize it. He paused. "My name is Corvin. I am his first advisor. I have been writing for 9 days." Something in her chest went very still. "Come in," she said. He sat at her small table and accepted the cup she gave him without comment, and she sat across from him and waited while he decided where to begin. The trial was not his, Corvin said. I need you to understand that before anything else I tell you. Varric did not authorize it. He did not design it. He did not know it was being convened until the morning it was held, and by that point, the compound had already been administered. What compound? Silvern said. Something the Cadrons have been developing for years, according to what we have been able to reconstruct. It was introduced through the ceremonial incense burned in the preparation chamber before formal crown proceedings. Every member of the court is exposed to it as part of the opening rites. In standard concentrations, it has no measurable effect. What was burned that morning was not a standard concentration. Corvin's voice was even, the voice of a man delivering facts he had already processed past the point of feeling them. It created a severance between his wolf's instinct and his capacity to act on it. He was present for every moment of the proceedings, fully aware. His wolf was active, fighting against every decision his body was making. He paused. He simply could not stop making them. Silvern thought about the amber eyes that had found hers in the silence after the pup chose her. The thing that had moved behind them, immense and unreadable. She had told herself, in the corridor outside the trial hall and every day since, that she had imagined what she saw in that moment. That it had been her own wanting, reflected back at her from a face that felt nothing. He sat in that judgment seat, Corvin continued, and gave that order to remove you, and felt every word of it as though it were being taken from him by force. And there was nothing he could do, not until the compound cleared his system, which took the better part of 3 days. 3 days, Silvern said, by which time you were already gone. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, Thornbarrow was moving through its morning. Someone was calling a child in from the cold. The ordinary world, doing what it always did, entirely indifferent to what was being dismantled at the table above the grain store. I want to believe that, she said carefully. I need you to understand that I want to believe it. But wanting to believe something is not sufficient reason to do so. No, Corvin agreed. He reached into his coat. This is. He placed a document on the table between them. The seal was intact, pressed into dark wax with the royal crest, but Silvern had spent enough months in the archives to recognize the difference between an authentic impression and one made from a copy. She broke it and read without touching the paper with her fingers. It was not an exile order. It was an order of execution, signed with the royal seal. Dated 3 days before the trial, she had been scheduled to die in the holding cells after the verdict was entered. The trial had never been intended to produce any outcome other than the one already written at the top of this document. She had stood in that circle and listened to 2 hours of fabricated evidence and believed, on some level, that the worst thing that could happen to her was to be formally discarded, to be publicly named as nothing and sent back to the outer territories to start again. The worst thing had a date. It had been arranged before she ever entered the hall. They did not want you gone, Corvin said. They wanted you dead before the imprinting had time to complete. Silvern looked up from the document. What happens, she said, when an imprinting complete is? Corvin's expression did not change, but something in his stillness shifted. It cannot be legally challenged by any instrument of the crown. It cannot be dissolved by decree, by council ruling, or by any formal proceeding under the law of any pack in Kerith. A completed imprinting between an alpha and his true mate is recognized as a bond above law. He held her gaze. The Cadrons had perhaps 8 weeks from the night of the storm before it became permanent and unassailable. The trial was the mechanism. You were the target. Silvern set the document down on the table. He has been looking for you since the morning the compound cleared, Corvin said, and his voice lost some of its precision, settling into something closer to plain statement. He sent me ahead because he did not trust himself to find you at the pace a search requires. A pause, brief and deliberate. He has not slept, Silvern. Not properly. Not since the morning he woke and understood what had been done. She held that at a careful distance from the rest of what she was feeling. She kept her eyes on the table. "There is one more thing," Corvin said. A watcher had been positioned in the upper gallery of the trial hall that morning. We identified him afterward. A Cadron retainer who had been placed there specifically to track your movements if you left Ashenvail without a formal ruling in hand. He reported your route to Kelrick within hours of your departure. His voice was flat with the particular anger of someone who had spent time being angry about something and arrived at a cooler version of it. "That is how they knew where to find you. Not through me, through him." She was still absorbing that when the window above the grain store shattered. The sound was followed immediately by a second impact against the outer wall, lower and harder, carrying the quality of something aimed with intention rather than force. Not weather, not accident. Corvin was on his feet before the glass finished falling. "They did not follow me here," he said, and his voice had changed completely. "They were already here." Corvin moved to the door with a speed that reminded her of what he was beneath the traveling clothes and the measured voice. He turned once. "The Millpond path leads to the western road. Do not stop until you reach the crossroads." Sylvan looked through the shattered frame. Shapes moved at the edge of the tree line behind the grain store. 4 of them. Coordinated and deliberate, with the practiced patience of people who had surveyed the location before they arrived. "Go," Corvin said, and went outside. She went. She took the Millpond path at a run, her breath coming in hard clouds in the cold air, her boots finding the frozen ground without hesitating because she had walked this route every day for 2 months and knew every uneven place on it. Behind her she heard the sounds of a fight beginning, the impact of bodies meeting the earth. A growl, low and controlled, that she recognized as Corvin. She reached the far side of the millpond and stopped. Not because she could not keep running. The crossroads were visible perhaps 3 minutes ahead. She was steady, her breathing controlled, the road open in front of her. She could make it. She had been making it in one form or another for the better part of a season. She stopped because of what she heard behind her. Corvin's growl had changed its quality. Effort had entered it. The sound of someone holding a line that was costing more than expected. And beneath it, a silence where a second set of sounds should have been, where a second wolf should have been audible, but was not. She thought about an older man with silver at his temples who had ridden 9 days to find her. She thought about standing in the accused circle with her wrists bound, while 200 people watched her be processed toward an ending that had already been written. She thought about the 6 weeks she had spent covering her wrist every morning and carrying the name Vera and holding very still and hoping that stillness looked enough like invisible. She thought about the pup choosing her in front of everyone and about the look on Varek's face in the one moment before he had to put it away. She turned around. She walked back along the millpond path at a steady pace. Not running, because running was something done by a person who had not yet decided. She had decided. The clearing behind the grain store had become a close and brutal thing. Corvin was in wolf form, bleeding from a wound along his flank, fighting 2 of the 4. The other 2 had positioned themselves between him and the cottage door with the patience of wolves, who understood how to let exhaustion accomplish what direct force had not managed. He was not losing yet. But the arithmetic of it was clear. None of them had noticed her yet. Sylvan walked to the center of the clearing and stopped. She had no weapon. She had no plan in the way that plans were usually understood. What she had was the thing that had been building in her for 2 months, pressing against the inside of her skin every night, making itself known in ways she had been explaining away and suppressing and covering with her sleeve every morning. The change that had no name because she had refused to give it one. She stopped refusing. It was not graceful. It was not the fluid shift she had read about in the archive texts, not the single clean breath she had watched wolves use to cross from one form to another. What happened to her was slower and rawer and frightening in a way she had not fully understood she was prepared for until it was already happening. But what came out of it was unmistakable. The imprint of the Alpha's bond radiated from her. Not as an attack. Not as a threat. Simply as a fact, broadcast at a frequency every wolf present was receiving whether they intended to or not. She was standing in the clearing being exactly what the bond had made her, and every wolf there felt what that meant in a register that ran deeper than training. The two wolves between Corvin and the cottage went still first. Then the others. All four of them turned toward her with the specific attention of animals whose instinct had just overridden their instructions, and what she saw in their faces was not aggression, it was recognition. The Cadron wolves held. They did not advance. Then the lead figure stepped forward. The one she had already identified as human, positioned outside the wolf formation, carrying the authority of someone who had been given command of this operation precisely because they were not subject to any of the instincts currently making the others hesitate. The weapon in their hand came up. The clearing exploded. The sound came before she saw him. Something massive moving through the western tree line at a velocity that did not leave room for anything standing in its path. Wood splintering, the ground taking the weight of something that hit it briefly and then was gone again, and then the lead figure was no longer standing. The black wolf circled the clearing once. It found each of the Cadron wolves in sequence, and she watched them make the calculation that every wolf makes when looking at something that exists beyond the category of opponent. One by one they went, back into the trees, until the clearing held only Corvin tending his flank in wolf form, and the massive shape of an alpha who had not shifted back yet. The black wolf turned toward her. It crossed the clearing with the deliberateness of something being careful about its own momentum. It stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the details of it, the breadth of its chest, the gold burning behind its eyes. It was not the same as looking at a man. But what looked back at her through those eyes was not only an animal either. It lowered its head. The shift happened between breaths. One moment the wolf. The next, Varek, standing in the frozen clearing with his eyes still amber and his breathing still uneven from the speed he had been moving at. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the trial hall in that one unguarded moment. Except that now, there was nothing careful about it. Nothing held behind glass. Nothing being managed. He took a step toward her and reached out his hand. She did not step back. But she said, quietly, "Wait." He stilled. "There is something I need to tell you before you touch me." Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Something I have been carrying since before the trial. Something I did not understand the full shape of until a few moments ago." She held his gaze. "The imprinting is not only a mark, Varek. Something has been happening to my body for 2 months. I have been refusing to name it. I was not certain I had the right to one." A pause. "I need to know whether you already understood what that meant before you decide what this moment is." Varek went very still. She watched his face in the failing light and tried to read what lived behind the stillness. Whether it was guilt, whether it was grief, whether it was something she had no name for yet either. She waited. He did not look away. "I did not know on the night of the storm," he said. "I did not understand what my wolf had done until Corvin found the first reference in the archive texts, 3 weeks after the trial." His voice was level in the way that levelness cost something to maintain. "I have been searching since then. There are 3 documented cases in Kareth's recorded history of an imprinting occurring across a human and wolf bond. In 2 of them, the human completed the shift over the course of several months." A pause. "In the 3rd, the human died before it could finish." Silverin did not move. "The Cadrons knew," Varek said. "I believe they knew before either of us did. If Kelric had someone watching the border lodge the night of the storm, he would have understood what the imprinting would eventually mean. An alpha's imprinted mate stands above every legal instrument he could ever construct. Every alliance, every betrothal, every agreement with every house in Kerith. There is no decree that reaches above it and no council empowered to dissolve it. His jaw tightened. We had perhaps 8 weeks from that night before the bond became permanent and beyond any challenge. They could not allow that to happen. So they built a trial, Sylvan said. They built a trial, he confirmed. And they built an exit. She thought about the document lying on the table upstairs, the date at its top, written 3 days before she had entered the hall. Why the trial at all, she said. If the order was already written, why not simply? Because a disappeared ward keeper from the outer territories draws considerably less attention than a dead one. The trial was a public record of justification. She was found guilty. She was remanded to custody. Whatever happened in custody afterward was an administrative matter. His voice did not change, but something beneath it did. It was careful. It was thorough. I have spent 2 months looking for the seams in it, and there are very few. She let the silence carry for a moment. On the day of the trial, she said. What did you feel? Varric looked at her. The compound severed my wolf from my actions, he said. It did not sever my awareness. I sat in that seat, and I was present for every moment of every proceeding. I could hear my wolf. I could feel everything it was feeling. I simply could not let any of it reach my hands or my voice. Something shifted in his expression, moving beneath its surface in the way she had first seen it move across the trial hall, and had learned since to read with increasing accuracy. I felt you enter the room before I saw you. The bond registered it and my wolf went. He stopped, started again. My wolf was not manageable that morning. It had not been manageable from the moment the compound took hold, and I understood what was about to happen and could not prevent it. The pup chose me, Sylvan said. Yes. And you felt what that meant? Yes. And you still gave the order? The words came out without cruelty. She was not saying them to wound him. She was saying them because they were the exact shape of the thing she had been carrying for 2 months, and she needed to put it down somewhere it could be seen clearly by both of them. Yes, Varric said. And every word of it felt like something being removed from me by force. Because it was. He held her gaze. I have thought about that moment every day since I understood what I had done, whether I could have fought it harder, whether there was something I missed, some path through what they put in me. A pause. I do not believe there was one. I have also not stopped believing I should have found one anyway. Sylvan was quiet for a long time. Around them the clearing had settled into the stillness of a place that had been violent and was not anymore. Corvin had shifted back and was seated against the grain store wall, tending the wound on his flank with the careful economy of someone practiced at the task. The tree line was still. Above Thornbarrow the sky had begun to go gray at its edges with the early approach of evening. I felt you through the bond, she said, on the day of the trial, the whole time I stood in that circle. Varric went very still. I felt your wolf fighting against everything that was happening. I felt it from the moment I entered the room until the moment the guards walked me out of it. She paused, and the words came slowly now, in the order they needed to come. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself it was what I wanted to be true, and therefore what I was projecting onto the only thing in that room that had looked at me like I was something other than a problem to be resolved. She looked at him. It never once occurred to me that what I was feeling was actually yours. Everything you felt was mine, he said. The control had left his voice entirely. What remained was simply true. Every moment of it. Then you felt me too. Yes. You felt me standing in that circle. Yes. You felt me leave. Something crossed his face. Not the carefully empty expression she had watched from across the trial hall. Not the gold fire of the wolf. Something quieter and more difficult than either. Yes, he said. Then you know, she said. That I did not leave because I stopped believing in you. The silence after that had weight to it. And you know, he said, that I did not let you go because I stopped wanting you. Sylvan felt something release in her chest. Not all at once, and not with any drama. The way ice released at the end of a long winter, gradually and without announcement, the pressure of it simply becoming, in some quiet moment, no longer there. She had been carrying that weight since the moment she pressed her back against the corridor wall outside the trial hall and made herself a promise about not crying. She had carried it through every morning in Thornbarrow, and every sleeve pulled over her wrist, and every night she had lain awake feeling something reach for her through the dark. It had been in all of it, the entire weight of it, and she had been so certain it was something she had done to herself. She let it down. He crossed the distance between them, and she did not step back. And when his hand came up, she turned her wrist and placed it against his palm, mark facing up, so that nothing was hidden or explained away. The mark flared with a heat so immediate it nearly stopped her breath. His hand covered it entirely. She felt the bond move between them the way she had felt it pulse in the nights above the grain store, except that now it did not have the quality of something reaching across a distance. It had the quality of something arrived. He rested his forehead against hers. Neither of them spoke. After a long moment, she said quietly, "There is more to be said." "There is," he agreed, "and more to be decided." "Yes, but not here." He lifted his head and looked at her. His eyes were amber and tired and carrying the expression of a person who had been traveling an extraordinary distance and had only just, in this moment, stopped. "No," he said, "not here." Behind them, Corvin cleared his throat with the diplomatic precision of a man, reminding two people that the rest of the world had not, in fact, agreed to pause on their behalf. "When you are ready," he said, his voice carrying the mildness of someone who had been waiting for the appropriate moment for some time. "There are things you both need to know about what has been happening in Ashenvail while you have been apart." Sylvan looked at Varek. Varek looked at Sylvan. The bond between them pulsed, warm and certain, and for the first time in 2 months the sensation of it was not a reaching towards something absent. It was simply what it had always been trying to become. "Tell us," Varek said. Corvin told them what had been happening in Ashenvail while they walked the horses out of Thornbarrow, and the village disappeared into the gray of early night behind them. Lord Kelrick had moved within 48 hours of Varek leaving the capital. The provision he invoked was an obscure one, buried in the 4th addendum to the Crown Charter, written 400 years ago to manage succession in the event of an alpha's sudden death or incapacitation. It had never been used for a living alpha. Kelrick had used it twice in 3 weeks. The first emergency session had declared Varek temporarily incapacitated for crown duties. The language in the formal record described a sustained and dangerous preoccupation that had rendered the king unable to govern, endangering the stability of Kerith and the welfare of its packs. A regent had been appointed pending the Alpha's recovery. Kelrick had been the only candidate proposed. The second session had declared Sylvan a criminal in absentia. The standing execution order had been entered into the permanent crown record. A formal edict had been issued, stripping legal protection from anyone who had aided or sheltered her. "Marin is among the hostages," Corvin said. "She intervened when the Cadrons began their inquiry into the Border Lodge records. They discovered it 3 weeks ago." Sylvan did not look away from the road ahead. She had not known Marin long. She had known her well enough. The woman had pressed a traveling pack into her hands in the dark of the servants' corridor on the morning she left Ashenvail and had said, with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided, that she would keep what she knew to herself. She had kept it for 2 months. "There is more," Corvin said. "A full session of the Pack Council has been called for tonight. Not at dawn as originally scheduled." Kelrick moved it forward. The purpose is formal and permanent dissolution of your alpha claim on grounds of demonstrated instability and the ratification of Maris as the first Queen Regent in Kareth's recorded history. If the session proceeds and the ruling is entered, it will be legally binding under the Charter. Even a completed bond would not override a formally ratified council ruling of that kind. He paused. He also declared that any alpha wolf who does not attend and cast their vote confirms their own defection from the crown. The silence that followed had a specific quality to it, not shock. Something past shock. How long? Varric said. 3 hours, perhaps less. They rode. The pup had not left Silverin's side since the clearing. It ran beside her horse with the quiet authority of something that had made a decision and saw no reason to revisit it. Varric had looked at it when they first set out, with an expression she did not have a complete name for yet. Something between recognition and something older than recognition. It has not done that before, he said, watching it move alongside her. Not with anyone. I know, she said. You are not surprised by it. I stopped being surprised somewhere around the 2nd month, she said, when it became easier to accept what was happening than to continue finding reasons why it could not be. Something moved behind his expression that she had learned to read, the quiet shift that belonged to the man rather than the king, the version of him that existed beneath everything else. They rode without speaking for a time, and the silence was not the silence of two people with nothing to say. It was the silence of two people who had been saying things for hours and had temporarily run out of words for the specific things remaining. The mark stopped reaching last night, she said eventually, for the first time since the storm. It is still there, but it is not searching anymore. No, he agreed. It is not. What does that mean in terms of the imprinting? It means it has found its other end, he said. The progression will complete in its own time now. It will not be entirely comfortable, but I am told it becomes less so as it finishes. A pause. The second documented case is 73 years old and lives in the Eastern Archive District. She was extremely direct about the process. Silverin looked at him. You found her, she said. I had 2 months and very little else to do that was productive, he said. Yes. The warmth that moved through her at that was not the bond. It was simpler, more ordinary. The warmth of learning that someone had done something careful and specific on your behalf during a time when you had no idea they were doing it. She was about to speak when the road curved and they came over the last rise before the capital valley. Ashenvail spread below them in the darkness. Its ancient spires reached toward a sky beginning to clear of cloud, the capital's lights scattered across the valley floor in a pattern she had first walked into 2 seasons ago with a diplomatic warrant and no idea what it would cost her. Above the great hall, the Cadron banner moved in the night wind. A rider came hard up the road toward them, one of Varric's own scouts by his markings, his horse breathing in long pulls from the pace he had been pushing. My king. The scout pulled up. Lord Kelric has moved the session forward again. It begins in under 2 hours now. He has sent word that the council quorum is already assembled. He caught his breath. There is something else. He has brought the hearthwolf inside the hall. The pup beside Silverin lifted its head. All the composure Varric had been holding left his face at once. She looked at him, then at the city below, then at the pup, which had fixed its gaze on the lights of Ashenvail with the patient attention of an animal that had already worked out the shape of what was coming. Then we do not waste the time we have, she said. They came into Ashenvail from the northern road, and the city met them like a held breath. The wolves who had stayed loyal had been waiting without being told to wait, which was the particular quality of loyalty that ran deeper than instruction. They came out of the side streets and the lower districts and the garrison quarters in 1s and 2s, and then in larger numbers, falling in behind Varric with the quiet efficiency of people who had been ready for this and were relieved to finally be standing in it. Not all of them. The Cadrons had been thorough. A significant portion of the guard had bent the knee to Kelrick's regency, some out of genuine allegiance to the house, and more out of the practical calculation of wolves who had watched an alpha disappear into a 2-month search and made a decision about which way the future was inclining. Those wolves were positioned at the key approaches now, the gatehouses and the corridor junctions, and they were not going to step aside without being directly asked. Varric asked them directly, not with words. An alpha operating at full capacity with a completed bond behind him was not a thing that needed to construct an argument. The wolves at the first 2 gatehouses stood down before he reached them. The ones at the third held longer, out of pride or fear of what Kelrick would do to them afterward, but they held for less time than they had likely planned to. The outer districts were clear within the hour. It was not without cost. 2 of the loyal wolves who had held positions inside the city for weeks, surviving on the margins of Kelrick's occupation, took wounds in the early exchanges that would need tending before morning. Sylvan noted them and filed the knowledge away for afterward. There would be an afterward. She was going to make sure of it. The Great Hall was not. Kelrick had withdrawn there with his core force and everything he considered worth protecting. The hostages were inside. Maren and 4 of Varric's loyal council members, and 3 servants who had been in the wrong position when the Cadron forces swept through the Crown Wing. Armed wolves guarded every approach to the hall, positioned with the thoroughness of a man who had anticipated this night and prepared for it well in advance. A servant came running to them from a side door, breathless and wide-eyed, with the specific urgency of someone who had been waiting for a moment to do what she had already decided to do. "The pup," she said, before she had properly stopped moving. "Lord Kelrick brought it in an hour ago. He has it confined near the dais. He said that if the king attempts to take the hall by force, he cannot be responsible for what happens to it." The effect on Varric was immediate and absolute. Something went still in him that Sylvan had not seen go still before, a different kind of stillness than the one she had watched from across the trial hall, with an entirely different quality of danger behind it. The pup beside her had gone alert. Its head was up. It knew, she thought, in the way it always seemed to know things before they were said aloud. "He will not act on it," Corvin said, his voice careful. "It holds more value as a threat than as an action. Kelrick understands that much." "He understands considerably less than he believes," Varric said, and his voice had the flatness of someone selecting words with precision because the alternatives were not available in the current setting. "Let me go in," Sylvan said. Everyone looked at her. "Not as a hostage exchange," she said, before the objection could be formed. "Not to surrender anything or offer myself as leverage. I am going in because Kelrick put the pup in that room without understanding what the pup will do when it sees me." She looked at Varric. "It will choose me again. In the same room where it first chose me. In front of every wolf Kelrick assembled to watch him win." Varric said nothing. "You will be at the doors," she said. "Corvin will be at the doors. Every wolf we came back with will be within 30 seconds of the hall. I am not walking in there to be taken. I am walking in there to show Kelrick that the thing he used as leverage against you is the exact thing that ends him. If he acts before the pup reaches you," Varric said. One sentence, flat and precise. "He will not act immediately," she said. "I am more valuable to him as a demonstration than as a casualty. He wants the assembled witnesses to watch the woman he convicted walk back in and capitulate. He will let me reach the center of the room before he does anything else. That is the kind of man he is." The silence was the silence of someone searching for the flaw in an argument and not finding it, hating that they could not find it. Varric looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she recognized, the gold behind his eyes threatening to overtake the careful composure he was holding. He was not afraid of the plan. He was afraid of the 17 things that could go wrong between the door and the center of the room, and he was working through each of them in the time it took to draw a breath. 30 seconds, he said, and the two words carried everything he was not saying. 30 seconds, she said. I will not need more than that. Whatever passed between them in the look that followed did not require words, and perhaps that was precisely what the bond was for. She turned and walked toward the great hall doors. Behind her she heard nothing, which meant he was letting her go. She did not look back. The great hall of Ashenvail looked different at night. She had stood in it before in morning light, when the high windows cast long, bright columns across the old flagstones, and the stone held a quality that almost passed for warmth. Now the torches had been lit along the walls, throwing everything into amber and deep shadow, and the ceiling above the chandeliers disappeared into darkness entirely. It looked like what it was, a very old room that had witnessed a great many things that could not be undone. She walked to the center of it and stopped. The configuration was different from the trial. No accused circle. The hostages were seated along the eastern wall under the watch of armed Cadron guards, their hands bound, their faces arranged in the careful expressions of people managing fear with what dignity they could find. The dais at the far end held two figures. Kelrick in the judgment seat, his silver hair catching the torchlight with the particular deliberateness of a man who had thought carefully about how he intended to be perceived during this moment. Maris standing beside him, her formal attire already arranged as though for a ceremony she had been planning for some time. They had been expecting her. "You came back," Kelrick said, and the satisfaction in his voice was the satisfaction of a prediction confirmed. "I had wondered whether you would have the nerve." "I came back," she said. She did not look at the hostages yet, though she had already found Marin in her peripheral vision, seated near the end of the line, her expression carrying the quality of someone who was angry on behalf of someone else rather than afraid for themselves. She looked at Kelrick. "I want to understand something before anything else happens here. You built all of this. The trial, the order, the regency. 3 years of construction to produce a mechanism that would remove me before the imprinting completed." Kelrick regarded her with the patient interest of a man who saw no reason not to confirm a thing that no longer mattered. "Closer to 3.5. 3.5 years, she said, "and at the end of it, you chose to bring the Hearthwolf into this room." Something shifted in his expression, very slightly. "An effective measure. The king will not risk." "You chose to bring the pup into the room where it first chose me," she said. "In front of the witnesses you assembled to ratify your regency. In front of Maris, who needs every one of those witnesses to believe that what the pup did during the trial was an accident without meaning." She paused. "Did you think that through entirely, Lord Kelrick? Did you follow it all the way to its end?" From near the dais she heard it, the sound of something pushing against a barrier with steady, patient persistence. Kelrick heard it too. His gaze moved sideways. "Hold it," he said to the handler positioned beside the dais enclosure. The handler was trying. The pup had decided otherwise. It came over the barrier the way it had come through the eastern pillars on the morning of the trial, with the unhurried certainty of an animal whose destination had never been in question. It crossed the great hall floor at a run, its paws loud on the old stone, and the Cadron wolves it passed either stepped back or watched it go with the expression of animals whose instincts were loudly disagreeing with the orders they had been given. It reached her. She knelt. The pup pressed its forehead to hers. The hall went silent. The same silence as before. The exact same quality of it. The full room instinct override, and every trained response suspended. But the cause was different this time. What they were watching was not an animal that had wandered into the wrong proceedings. What they were watching was the Hearthwolf performing the recognition greeting, the gesture reserved for pack and blood and bond, in the middle of the hall where its alpha's mate had been put on trial for a crime that the gesture made impossible to sustain as a legal position. The imprinting completed. She had not known exactly how it would feel. The archived accounts had described it variously. in language ranging from clinical to the kind of deliberate vagueness that suggested the writer had not wanted to commit to specifics. What it actually felt like was a door closing, not painfully, not with any drama, with the quiet finality of something that had been open for a long time finding its frame and settling into it without effort or resistance. The shift happened. Not as it had in the clearing outside Thornbarrow, with the rawness and difficulty of a first attempt. This was what the bond had been building toward through 2 months of covered wrists and sleepless nights and suppressed change. Clean and complete, the way the oldest shifts happened, and when it was done she stood in the great hall in her wolf form, her fur the pale frost white of new snow in deep winter, and the bond between her and Varek radiated outward from her into the room like a signal that every wolf present received simultaneously and without choice. The Cadron wolves began to step back. Not in fear, precisely. In the specific way that wolves stepped back from something they recognized as existing above the category they had been operating in. Kelric descended from the dais. He had something in his hand, a blade with the dull sheen of wolfsbane-treated steel, and his face was not the face of a man whose plan had gone as intended. It was the face of a man who had one move remaining and was committed to using it. He did not reach her. The great hall doors came off their hinges. What followed was not a battle in any formal sense. Varek's wolves were 30 seconds behind her, as agreed, and 30 seconds was more than sufficient for the specific work required. The Cadron wolves positioned throughout the hall made their calculations rapidly, and most of them arrived at the correct answer before they were asked. The ones who did not were handled by the wolves flooding in behind Varek with the efficiency of people who had been waiting outside a door for a long time and were very clear about what they were there to do. Kelric found himself with no remaining space to move and made one final attempt to use what he still held as leverage. It was a poor attempt. Sylvain, shifted back to human form now, handled it herself, with the calm of someone who had practiced fear for 2 months and had exhausted the supply of it entirely. Maris called for her father, then she called for order, then she stopped calling because the room had stopped responding. The hall was still. The hostages were cut free. Marin, when she reached Sylvain, took both her hands without speaking. She held them for a moment, and the grip said everything the silence was holding. And in the hall where Sylvain had stood in a silver cord with her wrists bound and 200 people watching her be assigned to a category she did not belong to, she stood now with no cord and no circle, and the pup pressed against her leg, and every witness Kelric had assembled stared at her with the stunned recognition of people in the urgent process of revising everything they had decided to believe. The hall was silent. Not for the last time. Lord Kelric was tried before the full pack council 3 days after the night the Great Hall fell, not by emergency provision invoked in a private session, with fabricated witnesses and a verdict written in advance. By the full formal process, in morning light, with every pack elder in Carith present, and the proceedings entered into the permanent record by 3 separate scribes. The charges were read in their entirety, which took the better part of an hour. Conspiracy against the crown, fabrication of evidence, administration of a controlled compound to a sitting alpha, corruption of crown proceedings, multiple counts of ordering unlawful execution. He was convicted on all of them. The sentence was death. It was carried out before the month's end, without ceremony and without appeal, which was the same consideration he had extended to those he had ordered killed. Maris was stripped of her house name and her pack status, and condemned to live outside the borders of Carith under permanent exile. She left Ashenvail without the silver pins in her hair, and without the certainty she had worn like a second garment for as long as Sylvain had known her face. The formal record noted her departure in a single line and spent no further time on her. The loyal council members were restored to their positions. The servants who had been held hostage were compensated from the Cadron estate, which passed in full to the crown upon conviction. Marin returned to the archives without ceremony and without comment, which was exactly the manner in which she had always done everything. That left the bond. On the second night after the Great Hall, Silvern and Varric were alone in the crown chambers, while the capital outside did the slow work of beginning to believe that the crisis was finished. The bond had completed itself during the shift in the hall. There was no ancient rite left undone, no formal gesture requiring performance. What remained was quieter than ceremony and more permanent than most ceremonies managed to be. There is a record element, Varric said, for the crown documents. The formal acknowledgement of the imprinted mate needs to be witnessed and entered. Corvin, she said. Corvin, and the record keeper. And whoever you want present on your side of it. Marin, she said, without hesitating. He looked at her with the expression that had become familiar to her now, the one that lived between the wolf and the man, and was perhaps the most honest version of both. The acknowledgement itself is brief, he said. I say what you are to me, and to the crown, and to Kerith. For the record. You have the right to respond or to say nothing, depending on what you choose. What do you want me to say? She asked. Whatever is true, he said. When Corvin and Marin arrived, Varric spoke first, as the form required. His voice was precise and level, the formal register she had not heard directed at her before, and he used it to say that she was his imprinted mate, recognized by the bond above law, and that her place in Kerith was not a grant of the crown, but a fact of nature that the crown was now recording for the benefit of those who required such things in writing. And then, departing from the formal language entirely, he said that she had chosen everything when everything had been taken from her, and that the crown record was going to reflect that too. Then she spoke. I want to say, she said, that the bond found us before we understood what we were to each other. That everything it built in the dark and against the active efforts of people who understood its implications better than we did at the time. She paused. And that I think it was right. She looked at him steadily. And I want to say that what happened in between was not a deviation from what this was meant to be. The trial, the exile, the 2 months in Thornbarrow covering the mark every morning and pretending it was not there. All of it. I think I needed to find out what I was capable of choosing when everything was taken from me. And I think the answer to that is the only version of me that belongs here. The acknowledgement was entered into the record. The bond, when the final words were spoken, did not flare or announce itself. It settled. The way things settled when they had found their correct position and had no further reason to search for one. The mark on her wrist became a silver scar. Clean and permanent, visible and unhidden. The record of a night in a storm-dark room where a wolf had recognized its mate before either of them had the language for it. She did not cover it the next morning. In the weeks that followed, Ashenvail recovered in the gradual and unglamorous way that cities recovered from crises that had been managed rather than catastrophic. Routine returned. Commerce returned. The outer provinces sent envoys who were considerably more interested in stability than in the details of what had produced the instability, which was practical of them, and perhaps wise. The pack elders who had attended Kelric's emergency sessions sent careful letters expressing various degrees of regret in varying qualities of sincerity, and Varric dealt with each of them according to what they deserved. The hearth-wolf continued to sleep where it chose, which was most often at Silvern's feet. She had stopped finding this remarkable some time before the end of the first week. On the morning of the first full-pack council session since the Restoration, Silvern sat in the chamber not in the accused circle, but at the table beside Varric, in the seat that had been empty since before the border lodge, and the storm, and everything the storm had set in motion. The council elder called the session to order. The scribes opened their records. The room fell into the settled quiet of formal business being conducted by people who were relieved to be conducting it. The pup sat at Silvern's feet throughout. It looked up at her once, with the settled patience of an animal that had been entirely certain about this outcome from the morning it escaped its handler and crossed a trial floor to find her. She looked back at it. The session proceeded. The scribes wrote. The city outside the high windows went about the ordinary business of a morning in a kingdom that had come through something hard and was on the other side of it. And the trial hall of Ashenvail, which had not been opened for a reckoning in 4 decades and had then been opened to try to remove her, became simply the room where the work of Carith was done. The room where, on one unremarkable morning among the many that followed, the bond was entered into the permanent record and remained there, unhidden, exactly as it had always been. That night, standing at the window of the crown wing with the city quiet below and the pup asleep between their feet, Varric asked her a question. "Do you regret any of it?" he said. "Not the trial alone, or the exile alone. All of it. The open question that contained every other question inside it." She considered it honestly, the way she had always tried to approach honest things. She thought about the accused circle and the silver cord and the verdict that had never been entered. About the room above the grain store and the name Vera, and the mark she had covered every morning while it told her the truth she was not yet ready to hear. About the pup crossing the floor of the great hall with the absolute confidence of something that recognized no obstacle in its path. About the night of the storm, and a wolf pressing its head against her hands in the dark, and the long and unglamorous and extraordinary process of becoming what the bond had known she was before she did. "No," she said. "I needed to find out what I was capable of choosing." He was quiet for a moment. "And what were you capable of choosing?" he asked. She looked at the city, at the silver scar on her wrist, unhidden in the dim light from the window, at the pup, asleep at their feet, with the absolute peace of a creature whose work was finished. "Everything," she said. Outside, Ashenvail was quiet and whole. Inside, the bond held. It would go on holding,